Before there was a city, there was a sound. Not silence. The Mesopotamian plain was never silent, but a low, continuous murmur. The kind that settles into your chest and stays there. It was the sound of the Euphrates in flood, carrying everything the mountains of Anatolia had loosened over winter: silt, reed, the occasional uprooted tree spinning slowly in the brown current. And when the water finally retreated, weeks later, it left behind a skin of clay so fine and so dark that the land seemed to breathe. Men and women who had been watching that river for generations knew what to do with it. They pressed it into shapes. They stacked those shapes into walls, and slowly, over centuries, the walls became cities. This is where Babylon begins. Not with a king, not with a god, not with a war, but with a river deciding, year after year, to deposit its richest sediment at a precise bend in its course, at the exact point where two great waterways came closest together, as though the earth itself had marked the location and waited. The Mesopotamian plain, the territory the Greeks would later call the land between the rivers, was a paradox from the beginning. It was flat in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate if you have never stood at its center and turned slowly in a full circle and seen nothing in any direction but horizon. No hills, no stone outcroppings, no forests, nothing to interrupt the eye or shelter the body from the weight of the sun. What it offered instead was the richest agricultural soil in the ancient world, deposited over millennia by the Tigris and Euphrates, as they drained the mountains and spread their burden across the plain. Properly irrigated, this land could yield grain harvests of a density that would have seemed impossible to farmers working the rain-dependent soils of most other ancient regions. The same rivers that gave, however, also took. They shifted course without warning. They flooded in seasons when flooding was catastrophic. They carried enough water to sustain a civilization, and enough violence to erase one. Living between those two rivers was not a pastoral arrangement. It was a negotiation, conducted across generations, between human ambition and hydraulic reality. What the plain lacked was everything else. There was no stone. The nearest quarries sat hundreds of kilometers away, in mountains that might as well have been another world. There was no timber for construction. The forests were further still. What existed in quantities that were essentially limitless was clay. The thick, plastic, alluvial clay that the rivers deposited with each flood could be shaped by hand when wet, dried in the sun into bricks that held their form in the dry climate of the plain, and fired in a kiln to become as hard as almost any building material the ancient world had access to. Mesopotamian civilization was built from clay in the most complete and literal sense possible. The walls were mud brick. The records were clay tablets pressed with reed styluses. The accounting tokens that tracked grain and livestock and commercial debts were clay. The letters that traveled between cities were clay. Even the stars were eventually recorded on clay, pressed flat and dried and stacked in temple archives that would outlast every wooden structure. Every textile, every organic material the civilization produced, clay was not a limitation. It was the medium through which an entire civilization thought. The Sumerians arrived at this understanding first. They had been building cities on the Mesopotamian plain since approximately 4,000 years before the Common Era, developing the first urban settlements in human history at Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, and dozens of other sites whose populations and organizational complexity had no parallel in the ancient world. They invented cuneiform writing, not as an abstraction, not as an art form, but because managing a city of tens of thousands of people, tracking the flow of goods in and out of temple storehouses, coordinating the collective labor required to build and maintain an irrigation network. Required a system of recording that human memory alone could not sustain. Writing was not, in this first iteration, poetry. It was accounting. The poetry came later, and when it did, it was extraordinary. The Sumerians also built the ziggurat, the stepped temple tower that would become the most recognizable silhouette on the Mesopotamian skyline. The form was not arbitrary. In a landscape without hills, the ziggurat was the hill. It raised the house of the god above the level of the human city, creating a vertical axis in a world that was entirely, almost oppressively, horizontal. When the Amorites arrived, moving in from the western steppes around 2,000 years before the Common Era, the Sumerian cities and their traditions were already ancient. Historians note that the settled Mesopotamian populations initially regarded the Amorites with something close to contempt. A nomadic people, without permanent homes, without proper burial customs, without the refined habits of urban life. The Sumerian literary tradition recorded this disdain explicitly. They were the people who did not know grain, who ate raw meat, who lived in tents. Within a few centuries, those same people had absorbed the cuneiform script, the Akkadian language, the administrative traditions, and the cosmological framework of the civilizations they had entered. They became, in every meaningful sense, Mesopotamians, and one branch of them settled at a bend in the Euphrates, at the narrowest crossing between the two great rivers, at the geographic point that controlled the overland and river traffic of the entire lower plain, and began building what would become the most important city the ancient world had ever seen. Babylon's rise was not, historians suggest, the result of a single brilliant decision or a single great ruler. It was the result of location. A city at that crossing could tax everything that moved. It could feed itself from the irrigated fields on either bank. It could connect itself, by water, to the commerce of the Persian Gulf, and by road, to the markets of the Levant and Anatolia. It was, in short, the place the world passed through, and the people who understood how to hold that place, patiently, generation after generation, built something that outlasted every rival. What they built exactly, and what it cost them, is a question the mud is still answering. He did not rush. That is the first thing to understand about Hammurabi. And perhaps the most important. When he came to the throne of Babylon around 1892 years before the Common Era, he inherited a city that was prosperous but not yet dominant. One player among many in a fragmented Mesopotamian world of competing city-states, each with its own patron god, its own ruling family, its own small army of bronze-armed infantry. A lesser ruler might have pushed immediately for conquest, might have spent his early reign in the exhausting cycle of campaign and counter-campaign that characterized so much of ancient Near Eastern political life. Hammurabi spent nearly 30 years doing something harder. He dug canals. He maintained correspondence with neighboring rulers in a tone of careful diplomatic equality. He managed the internal administration of his city with an attention to detail that his surviving letters reveal as almost obsessive, investigating reports of official corruption personally, ordering the repair of irrigation infrastructure, monitoring the treatment of ordinary citizens by local officials with a regularity that his subordinates clearly found unnerving. He was building something before he conquered anything, constructing the administrative skeleton of an empire before he had an empire to administer. And then, when the moment came, when the alliances had been made and tested, and the weaknesses of his rivals had been mapped with sufficient precision, he moved with a speed that left the diplomatic world of the Mesopotamian plain struggling to keep pace. Within a decade, The city-states that had regarded themselves as his equals were absorbed into the First Babylonian Empire. The man who had spent 30 years digging canals had, in 10 more, redrawn the political map of the ancient world. What he left behind that has endured longest is not a military victory, but a piece of stone. The Stela of Hammurabi, a column of polished black basalt, nearly 2.5 meters tall, its surface covered from base to crown in cuneiform inscription. Its upper face carved with a relief showing the king standing before the seated sun god, Shamash, receiving the commission to bring justice to his people, was rediscovered by French archaeologists at the Iranian site of Susa in 1901, where it had been carried as war plunder by an Elamite king, roughly 600 years after Hammurabi's death. It stands today in the Louvre in Paris. And the people who stop in front of it tend to go quiet, in a way that is not merely the hush of a museum. There is something about the specificity of the thing, the fact that you can read it, that the wedge-shaped marks pressed into that stone by a scribe over 3,700 years ago resolve themselves, through the patient work of modern scholarship, into comprehensible sentences about the price of hiring a boat, the rights of a woman in a failing marriage, the penalty for a builder whose poorly constructed house collapses and kills its owner, that produces a particular kind of vertigo. The ancient world is usually experienced as silence and distance. The Code of Hammurabi refuses that distance. Its 282 provisions speak in a voice that is specific, practical, and startlingly recognizable. Historians note that this was not, technically, the first written law code in human history. The Sumerians had preceded Hammurabi, most notably with the Code of Ur-Nammu from around 2100 years before the Common Era. But Hammurabi's code was the most comprehensive, the most systematically organized, and the most clearly articulated legal document to survive from the ancient world, and its influence on the subsequent development of Western legal and moral thought, primarily through its deep structural parallels with the law codes embedded in the Hebrew Bible, gives it a significance that no earlier legal text can match. The provisions themselves reward close attention because they reveal, in the way that only legal codes can, the texture of the society that produced them. Commercial life was clearly central. There are detailed regulations governing interest rates on loans, the maximum being 20% per year on silver and 33% on grain. Rates that tell us credit was already sufficiently established in Babylonian commercial life to require royal regulation. The construction industry was regulated with a ruthlessness that modern building inspectors might admire. A builder whose house collapsed and killed the owner was to be put to death. If the collapse killed the owner's son, the builder's son was to be put to death. The logic was proportional, the enforcement brutal, and the underlying principle that professional incompetence causing death was a criminal matter, was genuinely sophisticated. The principle of proportional punishment, what later legal traditions would call lex talionis, appears most famously in the code's provisions for physical injury. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Modern readers sometimes hear this as a cry for vengeance. But in its original context, historians suggest it functioned as a ceiling rather than a floor, establishing that the response to injury must be proportionate, not unlimited, that a man who lost an eye could not demand the death of the man who blinded him. The code also stratified its punishments according to social class, distinguishing between the free person of the upper class, the free person of lower status, and the slave, and applying different consequences for the same act depending on the social standing of both parties. This hierarchy reads uncomfortably to modern eyes, but embedded within it were genuine protections for the vulnerable. Widows, orphans, women in commercial and marital relationships, that reflected an understanding of law as something more than the enforcement of the powerful over the weak. Whether Babylonian society actually lived up to those protections is a different question, and one the stone does not fully answer. What the stone does answer, with absolute clarity, is this: Hammurabi understood that power without legitimacy is fragile, that an empire held together only by military force requires a constant expenditure of violence to maintain itself, and that a ruler who could make his people believe the law was just had built something more durable than walls. The stele was not merely a legal document, it was a political argument, inscribed in the hardest stone available, placed in the most public location possible, addressed to every person in the empire who had a grievance and needed to know that someone in authority had considered their situation and written it down. Whether that argument was fully honored in practice is the question every civilization since has been unable to stop asking about itself. There is a moment, in the great Babylonian creation epic, when the young god Marduk stands before the assembled divine council and makes a demand that no deity has made before. He will fight the sea dragon Tiamat, the primordial chaos from which everything came, the vast and terrible mother force that the younger gods are too frightened to face. But he will do it on one condition. If he wins, he will be made supreme among them, not first among equals, not honored above the rest. Supreme. The gods, trembling before Tiamat's assembled army, agree. And what follows is not merely a battle, but a cosmology, a complete account of how the world came to be, who ordered it, and why that order is centered on a particular city, on a particular bend of a river, in the middle of a flat plain. Marduk defeats Tiamat. He splits her body in two, stretching one half into the sky and pressing the other into the earth. He creates humanity from the blood of her slain consort Kingu, so that humans might labor in service of the gods and free the divine council for more celestial concerns. And he establishes Babylon, the gate of the gods, the point where divine order intersects with human life. As the earthly residence of the council he now leads. The Enuma Elish, whose name derives from its opening words, meaning when on high, was not simply a religious text. It was a political argument made in the language of mythology. And every Babylonian king who commissioned its recitation at the New Year festival understood exactly what it was saying. To rule Babylon was to rule the city that the supreme God of the universe had personally selected as his earthly home. To be king of Babylon was not to govern a prosperous city-state. It was to serve as the earthly regent of the divine order itself. The theological implications of this position were enormous, and the political implications were larger still. The god who anchored this entire framework, Marduk, had not always been supreme. In the early centuries of the Mesopotamian divine tradition, he was a relatively minor figure, the city god of Babylon, at a time when Babylon was itself a minor city. His rise to the top of the divine hierarchy tracked, with suspicious precision, the rise of Babylon to the top of the political hierarchy. Historians note this parallel without much surprise. Ancient religions were not static systems handed down complete from some original revelation. They were living traditions, continuously reshaped by the political and cultural circumstances of the communities that maintained them. As Babylon grew in wealth and power, its theologians, the priest-scholars of the great temple complex known as Esagila, meaning house with the raised head, developed and elaborated the mythology of their patron deity with increasing sophistication and ambition. The composition of the Enuma Elish, most likely reaching its full form sometime in the second millennium before the Common Era, was the culmination of this process. It took Marduk from local patron to cosmic sovereign in a single literary act, embedding that elevation in a creation narrative of genuine poetic power whose influence extended far beyond Babylonia into the biblical tradition and through it into the foundations of Western religious thought. The parallels between the Enuma Elish and the opening chapters of Genesis have fascinated scholars for well over a century. And while the nature of the borrowing remains a subject of ongoing historical debate, the structural similarities, the primordial waters, the separation of heaven and earth, the creation of humanity to serve a divine purpose, are too close to be coincidental. The physical embodiment of all this theological ambition was the ziggurat Etemenanki, whose name meant House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. The great stepped temple tower that rose above the Babylonian skyline and was visible for many kilometers across the flat surrounding plain. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Babylon in the 5th century before the Common Era, described it as a series of 8 ascending platforms with a sanctuary at the summit containing a great bed and a golden table, a space where the god was believed to descend and rest. Whether Etemenanki was the historical basis for the biblical Tower of Babel is a question that has occupied scholars and interested readers for generations. The Babylonian name for their city, Bab-Elim, meaning Gate of the Gods, is plausibly the origin of the Hebrew Babel, and the Genesis account of a tower built to reach heaven, interrupted by divine intervention and ending in a confusion of languages, carries enough structural similarity to the Babylonian ziggurat tradition to suggest some historical connection. What is certain is that Etemenanki was genuinely enormous, that it dominated the physical landscape of the city the way its theology dominated the city's intellectual life, and that the priests who served its summit sanctuary were among the most powerful individuals in Babylonian society, not merely because of their religious authority, but because of the extraordinary economic and administrative resources the temple controlled. The Esagila complex managed vast agricultural estates, herds of animals, workshops employing hundreds of craftsmen, and commercial networks that connected Babylon to the long-distance trade routes of the ancient world. The priests who oversaw these resources were educated men of genuine intellectual sophistication, trained in astronomical observation, mathematical calculation, and the deep textual tradition that constituted Babylonian learned culture. The ceremony that made all of this most visible was the Akitu festival, the great 12-day New Year celebration that was the most important event in the Babylonian religious calendar. For 12 days, the city became a theater of cosmic renewal, public processions, ritual drama, the recitation of the Enuma Elish, the symbolic reenactment of Marduk's victory over Tiamat, and his re-establishment of divine order for another year. At the center of this ceremony was a moment that no Babylonian king could have found comfortable, however many times he performed it. The king was brought before the high priest of Marduk, stripped of his royal regalia, struck on the cheek, made to kneel, and required to recite a formal declaration that he had not sinned against the city, had not neglected his people, had not failed in his duties to the god. Only after this humiliation was his kingship restored for another year. Historians suggest this ritual was not merely symbolic theatre. It encoded something that Babylonian political culture understood with unusual clarity: that authority is conditional, that the relationship between a ruler and the people and gods he serves is one of ongoing accountability rather than permanent entitlement. Every king who stood in that temple and accepted the blow knew, at least in that moment, that the city was not his. He was only borrowing it. What happened when kings forgot that lesson is a story Babylon would tell? At great cost. More than once. The scribe arrived at his workshop before the heat of the day made concentration difficult. He was not a young man. The years of training required to master the cuneiform script, with its several hundred distinct signs and their multiple context-dependent values, meant that a fully competent scribe was rarely young, and he carried himself with the particular quiet authority of someone whose skills were genuinely rare and genuinely essential. He settled onto his mat, reached for a lump of clay from the damp pile kept covered against the dry Babylonian air, and began working it with practiced hands into a tablet of the appropriate size for the transaction he had been hired to record. The room around him smelled of wet earth and the faint bitterness of the reed stylus he kept tucked behind his ear. Somewhere outside, along the canal that ran behind the row of commercial buildings where he worked, a boat was being unloaded, the rhythmic thud of grain sacks being transferred from deck to dock, the occasional sharp instruction of a foreman, the splash of water against a hull sealed with the dark, natural bitumen that seeped from the ground at several locations in the Mesopotamian region, and waterproofed Babylonian vessels the way no other available material could. This was a morning like other mornings. A transaction was being recorded. A debt acknowledged. A delivery confirmed. The clay would dry, be sealed with the personal cylinder seals of the parties involved, witnessed by named individuals whose own seals were pressed alongside, and stored in an archive where it could be retrieved if the terms were ever disputed and brought before the royal courts for adjudication. The Babylonian commercial system ran on clay, the way modern commerce runs on digital signals, invisibly, continuously, and with a reliability that participants trusted so completely, they rarely stopped to think about how extraordinary the underlying infrastructure actually was. The ordinary diet of a Babylonian household was centered on barley, the foundational grain of Mesopotamian agriculture. Hardier than wheat and more tolerant of the soil salinity that progressive irrigation inevitably introduced into the fields of the plain. Barley was eaten as bread, as porridge, and most significantly, as beer. Beer in ancient Babylon was not a luxury or a leisure activity. It was a staple, as fundamental to the Babylonian diet as the grain from which it was brewed. Administrative tablets from temple and palace archives record beer allocations for workers, officials, and temple personnel with the same bureaucratic matter-of-factness that a modern payroll system records salary payments. The quantities are substantial. The varieties are numerous. Ancient Babylonian brewing tradition distinguished multiple grades and styles of beer. From the thick, cloudy everyday drink, consumed through a reed straw, directly from the fermentation vessel, to lighter, clearer varieties reserved for formal occasions and elite consumption. Beer was safer than river water, which could carry disease. It was calorically dense in a way that supplemented a diet that might otherwise be monotonously dependent on grain alone. And it was a medium of social life, shared at the gatherings, festivals, and ordinary evenings that punctuated the rhythm of Babylonian existence in ways that the administrative record captures only obliquely. In the gaps between the receipts and the contracts and the astronomical observations, the commercial sophistication of ancient Babylon extended far beyond the individual scribe, recording a single transaction. The Babylonian financial system had developed by the second millennium before the Common Era. A suite of instruments whose conceptual sophistication would not be significantly improved upon for over 1,000 years. The interest-bearing loan, the arrangement by which a borrower receives silver or grain on the condition of repaying a larger quantity at a future date, was already sufficiently established in Babylonian commercial practice by Hammurabi's time to require regulation in the code, which specified maximum interest rates precisely because lenders had demonstrated a capacity to charge whatever the market would bear. Commercial partnerships allowed merchants to pool capital for long-distance trading ventures, distributing both the risk and the profit across multiple investors in arrangements whose legal structure the cuneiform tablets document with admirable precision. The deposit bank, through which wealthy individuals could place silver in the custody of a commercial house and receive interest on their deposit, while the house used the capital for its own lending operations, appears in the Babylonian record in a form recognizable to anyone familiar with modern banking. The most fully documented example of this commercial world in action is the archive of the Egibi family, a Babylonian commercial dynasty whose clay tablet records span approximately 5 generations from the 7th to the 5th centuries before the Common Era. The Egibi tablets document a diversified financial enterprise, combining money lending, real estate transactions, commercial partnerships, and agricultural estate management, a family business of genuine sophistication that historians have compared, without exaggeration, to the great banking families of medieval Italy. What made all of this possible was the written contract, the clay tablet recording the terms of a transaction, sealed and witnessed and legally enforceable through the royal courts. Without that institutional foundation, long-distance commerce on credit would have been impossible. With it, Babylon became the financial center of the ancient world. Among the most quietly remarkable figures in the Babylonian commercial landscape were the Naditum women of Sippar, a class of women dedicated to the temple of the sun god Shamash, whose religious status conferred on them a degree of economic independence that had almost no parallel in the ancient world. The Naditum appear in the cuneiform archive conducting commercial transactions, making loans, managing inherited property, and engaging in the full range of financial activity that their male contemporaries pursued, all in their own names. Without the male guardian that Babylonian law generally required for women in legal proceedings. They owned real estate. They wrote wills. They lent silver at interest and pursued debtors through the courts when payments were not made. The picture that emerges from these tablets is not the one that the code of Hammurabi's explicitly hierarchical social framework might lead a reader to expect. Babylonian society was patriarchal in its general structure, as virtually all ancient societies were. But within that structure there existed spaces, defined by religious status, by commercial necessity, by the particular logic of temple administration, where women operated with a freedom and authority that many later civilizations would not replicate. The clay tablets do not editorialize about this. They simply record the transactions, press the seals, dry in the sun, and wait in the archive for someone to ask what daily life in ancient Babylon actually looked like. The answer, when you read it in the original, is more complicated and more human than the monuments suggest. The roof of the ziggurat at night was cold in a way that surprised people who had only ever experienced Mesopotamia in its brutal summer heat. The same flat landscape that absorbed the sun's violence during the day released it with startling efficiency after dark. And by the middle of the night, the priest-astronomer who kept his vigil on the highest platform of the temple tower would have pulled his wool robe tight against a chill that had no business existing in a land associated, in every other context, with dust and heat and the shimmering exhaustion of a Babylonian afternoon. But he stayed. He had been trained to stay, and the training had begun early. Years of scribal school, years of memorizing the Great Omen series, years of learning to read the cuneiform records of his predecessors in the temple archive below. Records that stretched back further than any single human life, further than any single dynasty, accumulating across generations into a body of celestial observation whose depth and precision had no parallel anywhere in the ancient world. He had a clay tablet on his knee and a stylus in his hand. Jupiter was rising in the east, and its position relative to the fixed stars needed to be recorded, compared with the record of last month and the month before, entered into the ongoing mathematical model that the astronomers of his temple had been refining across generations. He was not practicing religion in the way that a modern person might understand the term. He was doing something that, viewed from a sufficient distance, looks remarkably like science. The mathematical foundation on which Babylonian astronomy rested was the sexagesimal system, the base 60 numerical framework that the Babylonians had inherited from their Sumerian predecessors and refined into the most powerful computational tool available in the ancient world. The choice of 60 as the fundamental unit was not arbitrary. 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. A range of factors that makes calculations involving fractions and ratios dramatically simpler than the base 10 decimal system allows. For the astronomical calculations that were the most demanding mathematical work of the ancient world, calculating the precise length of the lunar month, modeling the apparent motion of the planets against the background of fixed stars, predicting the occurrence of eclipses, the sexagesimal system provided a computational flexibility that its practitioners exploited with extraordinary skill. The legacy of this system in the modern world is so thoroughly embedded in daily experience that most people never notice it. The 60 minutes of the hour and the 60 seconds of the minute are direct descendants of the Babylonian base 60 framework. The 360 degrees of the circle, used in every geometric calculation, every navigational bearing, every astronomical measurement made anywhere in the world today, derive from the same tradition. Every time a pilot checks a compass heading, every time a mathematician calculates the area of a triangle, every time anyone anywhere glances at a clock, they are using a measurement system whose fundamental structure was established by Babylonian mathematicians working on clay tablets beside the Euphrates more than 4,000 years ago. The line of transmission is unbroken, even if it is invisible. The clay tablet, known as Plimpton 322, dated to approximately 1800 years before the Common Era and currently held in the collection of Columbia University, is perhaps the most famous single document in the history of mathematics, and what it contains still has the capacity to produce a kind of intellectual shock in people who encounter it for the first time. The tablet contains a table of numbers representing what mathematicians call Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 integers satisfying the relationship that the square of the longest side of a right triangle equals the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides. The relationship is named for Pythagoras, who lived in the 6th century before the Common Era. Plimpton 322 was written more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. The tablet does not merely demonstrate awareness of specific Pythagorean triples. The pattern of the numbers it contains suggests that its author possessed a systematic method for generating such triples, a general mathematical procedure, not merely a collection of observed examples. Historians of mathematics have debated the precise interpretation of the tablet for decades, but the underlying point is not seriously contested. Babylonian mathematics was not primitive calculation. It was genuine mathematical thinking, capable of abstraction and generalization, operating at a level of sophistication that the Greek tradition, which modern Western culture tends to regard as the origin of serious mathematics, was in significant respects building upon rather than initiating. The Babylonians also developed procedures for solving quadratic equations, equations involving squared unknowns, using methods that are mathematically equivalent to the algebraic techniques taught in modern secondary schools. Expressed not in symbolic notation, but in the verbal and numerical language of the cuneiform tablet. The astronomical achievement that most clearly demonstrates the scientific character of the Babylonian observational tradition is the identification of the Saros cycle, the period of 18 years and 11 days after which lunar and solar eclipses repeat in essentially the same pattern. To identify this cycle required something that no single human lifetime could provide. It required the accumulation of eclipse records across centuries. The patient comparison of those records across generations of astronomers working in the same institutional tradition. The recognition of a repeating pattern in data whose period was longer than most human careers, and the formulation of a mathematical model capable of generating predictions for future eclipses based on that pattern. The Babylonian astronomers who accomplished this were not working from theoretical first principles. They were working from data. Centuries of systematic observational data preserved in the temple archives, copied and recopied by generations of scribes who understood that the records of their predecessors were as valuable as any physical treasure the temple contained. The ability to predict eclipses in advance was both a genuine scientific achievement and a source of considerable political power for the priestly astronomers who possessed it. A king who received warning of an impending eclipse from his temple astronomers. In a world where unexpected celestial events were understood as divine communications of the most urgent kind, was a king whose decision-making was materially different from a king who was simply surprised. Historians note that the transmission of this accumulated Babylonian astronomical knowledge to the Greek scientific tradition occurring primarily through the direct contacts of the Hellenistic period. When Greek scholars traveled to Babylon and worked alongside Babylonian colleagues in the mixed cultural environment that followed Alexander's conquests, was one of the most consequential events in the intellectual history of the ancient world. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus, whose calculation of the precession of the equinoxes represents the most sophisticated achievement of ancient Greek positional astronomy, explicitly acknowledged his debt to Babylonian eclipse records extending back centuries before his own lifetime. Without that foundation, Greek mathematical astronomy would have been speculation without data. What happened to the men who built that foundation? And what happened to the city that housed the archives they filled? Is a question the night sky above the Euphrates keeps asking without quite answering. The army that appeared on the northern horizon in the summer of 689 years before the Common Era was not an army that anyone in Babylon had managed to forget. Even between its visits, the Assyrians had been the dominant military force in the ancient Near East for generations. And the specific character of their dominance, the iron weapons, the siege engineers of unmatched sophistication, the deliberate, systematic policy of mass deportation that broke conquered populations by severing them from the land and the language and the community that defined their identity, had produced in the peoples of the region a dread that was qualitatively different from the ordinary fear of military defeat. Other armies conquered cities. The Assyrians redesigned the psychological landscape of the ancient world. Their royal inscriptions celebrated their military achievements with a specificity of violence. The numbers killed. The cities burned. The captives paraded in chains through the streets of Nineveh. That was itself a weapon. A calculated projection of terror intended to make resistance feel not merely dangerous, but futile. And yet their relationship with Babylon was never simple. Never merely that of conqueror and conquered. Because Babylon occupied a position in the Mesopotamian cultural and religious imagination that no amount of military superiority could simply override. The city of Marduk, the supreme deity of the Mesopotamian divine world, carried a legitimizing weight that even the most ruthless Assyrian king could not afford to ignore. Conquering Babylon was not like conquering any other city. It required a theological justification, a narrative in which the conqueror presented himself not as a destroyer of the divine order, but as its restorer. Most Assyrian kings who took Babylon understood this, and governed the city with a degree of respect for its religious institutions. that they extended to almost no other subject population. Most, but not all. The destruction that Sennacherib visited upon Babylon in 689 years before the Common Era stood apart from every other act of military violence in the ancient Near East. Not because of its physical scale. Cities had been destroyed before. But because of its explicit theological intent, Sennacherib did not merely conquer Babylon. He announced that he intended to erase it. His armies tore down the temples and the palaces and the great mud-brick walls. They diverted the waters of the Euphrates through the ruins to dissolve the very bricks into the clay from which they had been made. They scattered salt on the ground. The god Marduk's statue was carried away to Assyria, an act that ancient observers understood, not as theft, but as divine capture. As a statement that Marduk himself had abandoned his city and transferred his favor to its destroyers. The shock that moved through the ancient world in response to this act was not merely the shock of military defeat. It was the shock of what appeared to be cosmic disorder. The supreme god of the universe displaced. His earthly home annihilated. The divine order that Babylon embodied apparently suspended. Sennacherib's own son and successor, Esarhaddon, understood the gravity of what his father had done and moved quickly to reverse it, rebuilding Babylon and restoring the cult of Marduk in a program of deliberate theological repair. Babylon, as it had before and would again, rebuilt itself from the mud. But the memory of what Sennacherib had done, the knowledge that even the greatest city, even the house of the supreme god, could be erased by a sufficiently determined enemy, settled into the Babylonian consciousness and did not leave. The Babylonian revenge came through a path that no one in Sennacherib's court had fully anticipated. The Chaldean chieftain, Nabopolassar, who seized the throne of Babylon in 626 years before the Common Era, forged an alliance with the Medes, the Iranian highland people whose own military power had been growing steadily while the Assyrian Empire's internal contradictions accumulated, and prosecuted a campaign against Assyria that ended, in 612, with the destruction of Nineveh itself. The city that had terrified the ancient world for centuries burned. Its great library of clay tablets buried under the collapsed roof of the palace that had housed it, preserved by the same fire that destroyed the building around them. Waiting in the darkness for the British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard to find them nearly 2.5 millennia later. The fall of Nineveh did not merely end Assyrian power. It created the political vacuum into which Nabopolassar's son, the crown prince Nebuchadnezzar, moved with the decisive speed that would define his entire reign. At the Battle of Carchemish in 605 years before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar shattered the Egyptian army under Pharaoh Necho II, ending any serious Egyptian ambition in the Levant and establishing Babylonian dominance over the entire eastern Mediterranean coast in a single engagement documented in both Babylonian chronicles and the Hebrew Bible. The ancient Near East had a new center of gravity, and it sat between the rivers. The consequences of that dominance arrived in Jerusalem in 587 years before the Common Era, with a finality that reshaped the history of religion in ways still visible today. Nebuchadnezzar's siege of the Judean capital, the culmination of a decade of increasing Babylonian pressure on a kingdom that had repeatedly miscalculated the limits of Babylonian tolerance, ended with the destruction of the First Temple, the institution that had been the theological and national center of Judean identity since the time of Solomon. The Judean elite, the priests, the scribes, the administrators, the skilled craftsmen, the royal family, were deported to Babylon in the mass population transfer that the Hebrew Bible records with a grief that still carries weight across the centuries. They arrived in a city of extraordinary sophistication, larger and more magnificent than anything in their previous experience. A city whose temples and astronomical learning and commercial organization and literary traditions represented the full accumulated achievement of a civilization that had been building and thinking and recording for 2,000 years. Before Judah existed as a political entity, the encounter transformed them in ways that neither they nor their Babylonian hosts fully anticipated. The theological crisis generated by the destruction of the temple, the agonizing question of how a God who had promised to protect his people could have allowed their national sanctuary to be burned by a foreign king, produced the prophetic literature that defined the mature form of biblical theology, and the encounter with Babylonian cosmology, legal tradition, and literary culture left traces in the biblical text whose precise nature scholars continue to debate, and whose significance for the subsequent development of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is impossible to overstate. The exiles sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept, as the psalm records, but they also watched, and listened, and thought, and what they brought home with them. When the exile finally ended, was not only their grief. Stand at the entrance to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin on any given morning and watch the moment people first see it. They come around a corner, following the signs, expecting another museum artifact, another carved relief, another explanatory panel, another ancient object behind glass, and then the Ishtar Gate fills their entire field of vision and they stop. Not pause. Stop. The gate rises more than 14 meters. Its surface covered in brilliant glazed bricks of a blue, so saturated and so specific that no photograph has ever quite captured it. A deep lapis color that seems to generate its own light, against which the bas-relief figures of dragons and bulls march in rows of yellow and white and brown, with a precision and a visual power that makes the several thousand years since their creation feel, for a moment, entirely irrelevant. The dragons are the mushhushu, the sacred animal of Marduk, long-necked, scaled, with the hind legs of an eagle, and a tail that curves with the particular elegance of something designed by people who understood that beauty and authority are not separate considerations but aspects of the same statement. The bulls belong to the storm god Adad. Together, they processed along the walls of the processional way, the great ceremonial avenue that led through the gate into the city of Babylon. In alternating rows that a visitor walking that corridor would have experienced as something between a parade and a dream, lions lined the walls on either side, each rendered in slightly different shades of yellow against the blue background, so that the corridor seemed to breathe as you moved through it. Nebuchadnezzar II built all of this. He also destroyed Jerusalem, deported entire nations, and according to the book of Daniel, lost his mind so completely that he spent 7 years living in the open fields, eating grass like an animal, his hair grown long as eagle feathers, his nails curved like the claws of a bird. The same man. That is the thing about Nebuchadnezzar that no single narrative quite manages to contain. The city he built was genuinely without parallel in the ancient world. Babylon, at its height under Nebuchadnezzar, covered approximately 900 hectares within its walls. An urban area whose population historians estimate at around 200,000 people, a figure that would not be matched by any city in the Western world for over 1,000 years after Babylon's fall. The great double wall system that enclosed this population was among the most formidable urban fortification ever constructed in the ancient Near East. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited in the 5th century before the Common Era, described the walls as wide enough for a 4-horse chariot to turn around on top, a detail that may involve some rhetorical inflation but captures the essential reality that these were walls of a scale that contemporary military technology had almost no answer for. The Euphrates ran through the center of the city, crossed by a bridge whose stone piers have been identified in the archaeological remains, connecting the eastern and western halves of the urban fabric in a piece of engineering that was for its time. Extraordinary. The temple complex of Esagila, with its treasury of hundreds of kilograms of gold and silver in various forms and thousands of square meters of the finest textiles, anchored the religious and economic life of the city. Rising above everything was Etemenanki, the great ziggurat, whose summit sanctuary was the theoretical resting place of Marduk himself, visible from the flat surrounding plain, at a distance that made it. For travelers approaching Babylon for the first time, the first thing they saw and the last thing they forgot, the hanging gardens, traditionally counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, remain the most tantalizing mystery of Babylonian engineering, described in detail by ancient sources whose accounts suggest a garden built on a series of vaulted terraces with trees and flowering plants growing at elevated levels, watered by some mechanical system drawing from the Euphrates. No conclusive archaeological evidence has yet confirmed their location within the city. They may have existed exactly as described. They may have been elaborated in the retelling. The ancient sources that mention them are unanimous in the impression they produced. And Babylon was a city that specialized in producing impressions it was impossible to forget. Nebuchadnezzar himself was the most consequential ruler of the Neo-Babylonian period, and one of the most psychologically complex figures in the entire history of the ancient Near East. His military campaigns were conducted with a ruthlessness that matched anything in the Assyrian tradition he had replaced. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 18 months. The deportation of the Judean population was systematic and deliberate. The destruction of the First Temple was thorough. His building programs were driven by an ambition that the inscriptions he left behind describe in terms of explicit cosmic significance. He was not merely constructing buildings. He was completing the divine plan, making his capital worthy of the God who had chosen it. The scribal schools of his Babylon maintained a curriculum of extraordinary intellectual range. The cuneiform writing system in its full complexity, the mathematical tradition that produced solutions to quadratic equations, the astronomical observation program that was generating the predictive models of celestial motion, the medical and pharmacological traditions preserved in the great reference works of Babylonian learned medicine, and the literary tradition whose crown jewel was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of narrative literature in human history. Nebuchadnezzar patronized all of it with the attention of a ruler who understood that the intellectual life of his capital was as much a monument to his greatness as the blue-glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate. The madness described in Daniel, the 7 years of animal existence, the loss of reason that the biblical text presents as divine punishment for a king who gazed over his magnificent city and declared that he had built it by the might of his own power, for the glory of his own majesty, may be literary invention, a theological dramatization of the principle that human pride, operating without acknowledgement of divine authority, invites catastrophic correction. Historians note that there is no Babylonian record confirming a prolonged period of royal incapacity during Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and the administrative continuity of his government argues against a literal 7-year absence from power. But legends do not attach themselves to ordinary men. They attach to figures whose actual historical presence was large enough and strange enough and powerful enough to generate a mythology that outlives the facts. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 years before the Common Era, after a reign of 43 years, the empire he left behind was the most powerful political entity in the ancient Near East. What happened to it in the 23 years that followed his death is a study in how quickly extraordinary achievements can be undone by the ordinary human failures of the people who inherit them. The throne of Babylon passed through 4 pairs of hands in 23 years, and none of those hands held it with the steadiness that Nebuchadnezzar had managed across 4 decades. His son, Marduk, the figure the Hebrew Bible calls evil Merodach, ruled for 2 years before being murdered by his brother-in-law Neriglissar. who ruled for 4 years before dying in circumstances that the sources do not describe with sufficient clarity to fully reconstruct, leaving the throne to his young son Labashi Marduk, who was removed from power within months by a court conspiracy that placed a Babylonian general named Nabonidus on the throne in 556 years before the Common Era. 4 kings in 23 years. Each transition involved violence or its immediate proximity. Each new ruler inherited not only the imperial apparatus that Nebuchadnezzar had built, but also the accumulated anxieties of a court that had watched that apparatus prove insufficient to protect the men who sat at its center. The specific political culture of the Neo-Babylonian court, in which military commanders possessed sufficient independent power to overthrow rulers they found unsatisfactory, in which the priestly establishment of the great temple complex controlled economic and ideological resources that no king could safely ignore, and in which the memory of Nebuchadnezzar's greatness functioned as a standard against which every successor was inevitably and unfavorably measured, made the throne of Babylon in the years after 562 an extraordinarily dangerous place to sit. Nabonidus, who seized it through conspiracy and held it for 17 years, was the strangest occupant that throne had ever known, and his strangeness would cost Babylon everything. What made Nabonidus strange was not his cruelty. He was not, by ancient Near Eastern standards, a particularly violent ruler, but his theology. In a city whose entire political legitimacy rested on the relationship between the king and the god Marduk, Nabonidus was devoted to Sin, the moon god, whose primary cult center was not Babylon, but the northern city of Haran, where Nabonidus had personal and family connections. This preference was not a private eccentricity. It expressed itself in public religious policy, in the promotion of Sin's cult at the expense of Marduk's, in decisions about temple resources and royal patronage that the priestly establishment of the Esagila experienced as a systematic demotion of the god whose supremacy was the theological foundation of the entire Babylonian order. The resentment this generated among the priests was genuine and deep, and it compounded a political crisis that Nabonidus then made dramatically worse by doing something that no Babylonian king had ever done before. He left. Around 552 years before the Common Era, Nabonidus departed Babylon for the oasis of Tamar in northwestern Arabia and remained there for approximately 10 years, governing his empire through correspondence and leaving his son Belshazzar in Babylon as regent. The ancient sources suggest multiple possible motivations for this extraordinary absence: religious interest in the moon, God's southern sanctuaries, commercial ambition regarding the Arabian trade routes, some form of personal crisis or illness whose nature the records do not clarify. What is certain is the consequence: the Akitu festival, the great New Year ceremony that required the king's personal presence in Babylon for its proper performance, could not be celebrated during the years of Nabonidus's absence. The ceremony that annually renewed the divine mandate of the king and reaffirmed the cosmic order anchored in Babylon simply did not happen. Year after year, the festival that the city's entire theological identity depended upon went unobserved, and the priestly establishment recorded this failure in their chronicles with a cold, specific fury that suggests they understood exactly what it meant. Belshazzar held the city in his father's absence, with the particular anxiety of a man whose authority was borrowed and whose position everyone around him understood to be conditional. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great had been expanding eastward and westward with a speed and completeness that had no recent parallel in ancient Near Eastern political history. The Median Empire had fallen to Cyrus. Lydia, in western Anatolia, had fallen. The Babylonian provincial forces defending the approaches to the capital had been defeated at the Battle of Opis. The empire that Nebuchadnezzar had built at such cost that had seemed so permanent in its glory, was dissolving at its edges with a rapidity that the court in Babylon found difficult to fully absorb. The biblical account of Belshazzar's feast, the episode in the book of Daniel in which mysterious writing appears on the wall of the banquet hall during a royal celebration, interpreted by the prophet Daniel as predicting the imminent end of Babylonian power, is almost certainly a literary dramatization rather than a literal historical record. But the image it projects, of a regent feasting with his court while the political foundations of his world collapsed around him, captures something that the historical sources, taken together, suggest was genuinely true about the psychological atmosphere of Babylon in those final months. The walls were still standing. The city was still the largest and most magnificent urban environment in the ancient world. The treasury of the Asagila still contained its extraordinary concentration of precious wealth, and yet something essential had already gone. The confidence, the theological coherence, the sense that the relationship between Babylon and its god was intact and active and protective. A city whose king had been absent for a decade, whose most important religious ceremony had gone unperformed for years, whose priestly establishment had been systematically alienated by a ruler who preferred another god. That city, however magnificent its physical defences, had already lost the will that fortifications alone cannot substitute for. Nabonidus returned to Babylon sometime before the Persian advance reached the city. But the return was too late and too compromised to repair what his absence had broken. The priesthood of Marduk, whose active ideological support was essential for any Babylonian ruler's legitimacy, had effectively withdrawn that support before Cyrus arrived. When the Persian king's propaganda presented him as the chosen instrument of Marduk himself, the righteous ruler, whom the god had selected to replace the impious Nabonidus and restore proper worship to the city, the moon god devotee had neglected. The Babylonian priestly establishment found the argument not merely plausible, but welcome. The gates of the greatest city in the world were, in some meaningful sense, already open before Cyrus reached them. How a conqueror walks through an open gate, and what he says when he gets inside, and what that moment meant for every people the Babylonians had themselves once conquered. That is where the story arrives at its most consequential and most quietly devastating turn. Cyrus the Great entered Babylon in October of 539 years before the Common Era, and the city did not burn. That is the fact that every account of this moment returns to, because it contradicts everything that the ancient Near East had established as the normal grammar of conquest. Cities that fell to foreign armies burned. Their temples were looted or destroyed. Their gods were carried away as trophies. Their populations were deported to distant corners of the victor's empire, scattered and broken in the systematic way that the Assyrians had perfected and that subsequent conquerors had imitated. Babylon had itself followed this grammar when Nebuchadnezzar's armies took Jerusalem. The grammar was understood by everyone. And then Cyrus arrived, and the grammar changed. The Persian king walked into the largest city in the world at the head of an army that had just defeated the Babylonian provincial forces at Opis. And he presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, the chosen instrument of Marduk, selected by the god himself to restore proper worship after the impiety of Nabonidus, to return to their sanctuaries the divine statues that the last Babylonian king had removed, to release from captivity the peoples that Babylonian policy had displaced across the decades of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Chronicle records the entry without drama, noting that Cyrus entered the city in peace and that no calamity occurred. The contrast with the description of Sennacherib's destruction of Babylon, recorded in the same chronicle tradition, with an outrage that still radiates from the clay after 2.5 millennia, could not be more complete. the city that had survived Assyrian conquest and Assyrian destruction, and the long internal decay of the years after Nebuchadnezzar fell. In the end, not to fire, but to a proclamation. The document that Cyrus left behind to mark this moment is the Cyrus cylinder, a barrel-shaped clay object inscribed in cuneiform, deposited in the foundations of the Esagila temple, and rediscovered by archaeologists in 1879. The cylinder records, in the careful theological language of the Babylonian scribal tradition, the Persian king's claim to have been chosen by Marduk, his restoration of proper religious practice, his return of displaced divine statues to their sanctuaries, and his authorization of the return of deported peoples to their homelands. This last provision is the one that connects the cylinder most directly to the biblical tradition, because it is the policy that the books of Ezra and Chronicles record Cyrus extending specifically to the exiled Jewish community in Babylon, the authorization to return to Judea and rebuild the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed. The cylinder has been described in modern times as the world's first declaration of human rights, a characterization that most historians regard as an anachronistic overstatement. Cyrus was practicing sophisticated imperial politics, not articulating universal principles, but that reflects the genuine unusualness of a conquering ruler whose primary instrument of consolidation was magnanimity rather than terror. The Jewish community in Babylon, whose theological transformation during the exile had been so profound and so generative, began its journey home, carrying with them a literature shaped in part by the encounter with the civilization that had held them captive. The final form of large portions of the Hebrew Bible was edited and assembled in Babylon or under the direct influence of the Babylonian exile. The creation narrative of Genesis, the flood story of Noah, whose structural parallels with the Babylonian flood narrative embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh are too specific to be coincidental. The legal codes of Deuteronomy, whose relationship with the Code of Hammurabi has been debated by scholars for over a century. All of these texts passed through the Babylonian experience on their way to the form in which they entered Western religious tradition. Babylon shaped the Bible that would later condemn it. The city itself did not end with the Persian conquest. It continued under Persian administration. Then, under the Macedonian rule that followed Alexander the Great's defeat of the Achaemenid Empire in 331 years before the Common Era, Alexander, who had intended to make Babylon the capital of his new world empire, and who died there in 323, possibly of fever, possibly of poisoning, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Under the Seleucid Empire that succeeded Alexander's fragmented conquests, Babylon remained a functioning city. Its intellectual traditions maintained in the great cuneiform temple libraries, where the astronomical and mathematical and literary heritage of 2 millennia continued to be copied and studied. The last dated cuneiform tablet found by archaeologists comes from Babylon in 75 years of the Common Era, nearly 6 centuries after Cyrus walked through the gate. The scribal tradition that Babylon had maintained continuously since the Sumerians was still producing documents in the writing system that the city had inherited and perfected. Then it stopped. The city emptied slowly, its population drawn away to the new Seleucid capital of Seleucia on the Tigris, its mud brick buildings dissolving in the infrequent rains, its great walls subsiding back into the clay from which they had been raised, until the site that had once housed 200,000 people was a series of low mounds in the Iraqi desert, their contents unknown, their significance forgotten by everyone except the biblical tradition that remembered Babylon as a name for everything, proud and doomed and magnificent and corrupt. The recovery began in the 1840s, when the British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard, excavating at Nineveh, found the clay tablet library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal which contained copies of Babylonian texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Great Omen series, that had been composed centuries before the Assyrian king collected them. The decipherment of the cuneiform script by Henry Rawlinson and others in the following decades opened these texts to the world, and the revelation that the cuneiform libraries contained sophisticated literary and scientific and legal traditions whose depth exceeded anything previously imagined produced one of the great intellectual reckonings of the 19th century. The German archaeologist Robert Koldewey excavated the site of Babylon itself between 1900 and 1917, recovering the Ishtar Gate, dismantled, transported to Berlin, and reassembled in the Pergamon Museum where it stands today, stopping people cold with its blue-glazed certainty that beauty survives everything. The ghost of Babylon is in every clock that measures 60 minutes. Every compass that divides the circle into 360 degrees. Every calendar that organizes time into 7-day weeks. Every contract that records a commercial obligation in writing and makes it enforceable through a court of law. Every astronomical observation that builds on the accumulated data of the Babylonian temple archives. Every legal system that attempts to make punishment proportional to injury. Every flood story that places a single family on a boat while the waters rise. It was built from clay between two rivers by people who had no stone and no timber and unlimited patience. It became the engine of human civilization. It fell in a night, and it never entirely left. We are all, whether we have ever thought about it or not, living in a world that Babylon made.